Hey everyone, it's Jaeyoung here, and welcome to the Overwatch patch 1.43 overview. This is honestly one of the biggest patches to the game, not in terms of the number of changes, but also the amount of impact it will have on the meta going forward. I usually go through the changes by buffs, nerfs, adjustments, and whatever else, but for this one, I'll just go through it by each role, starting with the tanks. This is the final patch for the year, so let's get to it.
These kind of patch videos are usually finished a day or two before the live update of the patch. And what doesn't happen often, sometimes Blizzard will ship out additional changes or new ones live at previously noted here. If changes are easily possible, they apologize in advance if these changes are different or not included at all video.
Oh, this is my jam!
Okay, firstly, the old skirmish mode has been removed from the game and replaced with its arguably better older sibling called While You Wait. How it works is that while in queue, players will now be able to choose from the following game modes: Practice Range, which can actually now be entered as a group, Skirmish, which is basically the old one, Deathmatch, and Custom Game. So this is obviously great and is a feature that has been called for by multitudes of high-ranked players, particularly DPS ones, as the queue times ever since role lock was introduced have been frankly pretty gross. Anyway, that's it for that, let's move on. Speaking of role lock, there have been a bunch of soft reverts to changes that were implemented before it was introduced, with an example being giving back Lucio some of his speed boost power. And now we have a complete reversion of the armor damage reduction change that happened at the start of the year. It used to be that armor reduced incoming instances of damage by 5, which was then reduced to 3 in patch 1.32. But now we see armor being returned to its former strength of reducing damage instances by 5. Obviously, tanks and to a larger extent, other heroes with armor are the biggest winners of this particular reversion. So real quick, for those of you who don't know how armor works right now, basically it reduces incoming damage by 5, but if the damage is less than 10, it instead cuts it in half. So for example, a shot by McCree would have its damage reduced from 70 to 65, and a bullet from Sombra would have its damage halved from 8 to 4. As such, this makes armor very effective against heroes that deal damage across multiple instances with weapons like shotguns or rifles, but not as good against heroes with burst damage such as Widowmaker or Doomfist. And in regards to how it interacts with beam weapons like Zarya's particle cannon and Winston's Tesla cannon, it's still the same 20% damage reduction. Yeah, so this sucks for heroes like Soldier 76, who honestly has been a complete dumpster fire of a hero for more than a year, though we'll have to see where he stands when the meta settles in a couple of weeks. Maybe. Probably not. On the flip side, this is really good for a hero like Brigitte, as it adds so much more potency to her armor pack ability as well as her ultimate rally. And honestly, she really isn't as bad a support hero as people like to think, because in my opinion, everyone was just so used to her extremely broken form before her rework. Besides, you can just ask streamer Violet what they think about Brigitte as a hero, because just look at what they did in season 18 with her. It's super impressive to say the least. Moving on from the general armor change, D.VA's defense matrix cooldown has been decreased from 2 seconds to 1.5 seconds. This buff follows the previous one in patch 1.41, where its regeneration rate was increased from 12.5% to 16% per second, and the delay before regeneration begins lowered from 1 second to 0.75 seconds. So let's be honest, D.VA's been kind of hot garbage in the double bear meta, which was honestly quite a pain point for those who mained her during her off-tank dominance for like the past 2 years. However, with the huge changes to the other tanks this patch that we'll discuss later, alongside this buff, I think she might finally have her foot in the door.
Did someone say dive?
Anyway, keep in mind that while Overwatch does not show decimals for your cooldowns in-game, it's still very much there. This buff is great, but like I said, it's the other changes this patch that are going to help as well, so let's keep going. And while we're on the subject of off-tanks, Zarya has also received a buff this patch, increasing her particle cannon explosion radius from 2 to 2.5 meters and decreasing its ammo cost from 25 to 20. So the increase in its explosion radius is another example of a revert. Earlier in the year, before it was changed to a locked 2 meter radius, if I remember correctly, it used to scale with Zarya's energy level from 2 to 3 meters. Having the explosion radius now be at a locked 2.5 meters is a nice middle ground, though I will admit I still prefer how it used to scale with energy, because it rewarded players that managed their energy better. And additionally, the ammo cost of her grenades has been reduced to 20, down from 25, meaning that players can now launch up to 5 grenades instead of 4 before having to reload her cannon. Admittedly, an extra shot into something like a Graviton Surge will honestly be quite useful to deal that little bit of extra damage to finish off your targets. Anyway, that's it for off tanks, let's move on. There are some big changes to the barrier tanks this patch, and we're starting with Orisa, who has her base armor increased from 200 to 250, giving her a total of 450 health. The movement penalty when shooting her fusion driver has been reduced from 30% to 20%, 50%. Her protective barrier's health has also been reduced from 900 to 600, and her Fortify cooldown has been decreased from 10 to 8 seconds. Okay, firstly, the extra 50 armor giving her a total of 250 is honestly quite disgusting, especially when paired with Fortify and accompanied by the armor buff this patch. This is due to how damage reduction is ordered, in that Fortify's 50% damage reduction is actually applied first to incoming damage before it is finally further reduced by armor. So in this instance, a bullet from someone like Soldier 76 would have its damage reduced from 20 to a measly 5. In some cases, it might come to a point where it's not really even worth shooting at an Orisa while she's fortified. But in gaining a monstrous amount of self-sustain, Orisa players will have to give up a massive amount of barrier utility, losing out on 300 health. It's kind of strange to live in a world where Orisa's barrier has less health than Winston's bubble, but here we are, I guess. Shield management and positioning is going to matter more than ever now, because 600 health really isn't that much, and if you happen to get caught out in the open without your Fortify, you're going to be in big trouble. Thankfully, the 2-second reduction in Fortify's cooldown, lowering it to 8 seconds, is going to help ease that pain quite a bit, because like I said before, it's disgusting how tanky you become when you turn gold. Anyway, speaking of positioning, the movement speed penalty when shooting her fusion driver is reduced from 30% to 20%, and is a neat little change that helps when you want to move forward to take space aggressively, or even backing up while still shooting. Overall, it's hard to quantify just how good or bad this change is, because she's not the only tank being drastically altered, so let's go over the rest first before we make any conclusions. So Reinhardt's barrier field's health has been reduced from 2000 to 1600, but the movement speed penalty when it is deployed has also been reduced from 50% to 25%, and his passive Steadfast has its knockback resistance increased from 30% to 50%. Okay, I want to talk about his movement speed while the barrier is deployed first. It's actually so fast, it's kind of almost ridiculous. I mean, he's been using it for years, so it kind of makes sense that he's able to move faster with it, but kind of does really seem super fast. It's like anime speed lines kind of fast, you know? So when paired with Lucio's on-amp speed boost, Reinhardt can now move with his barrier deployed about as fast as his usual walking speed. Pairing a Reinhardt with a Lucio has always been pretty essential, and while I don't think that pairing is going to go away, it's nice to not have to be as reliant on a Lucio's speed to maximize Reinhardt's potential. But obviously, the law of equivalent exchange means he loses 400 health from his barrier field, which is kind of a big deal, because of all the tanks with barriers, Reinhardt is definitely the most reliant on his due to not having a self-sustain ability such as Fortify or Kinetic Grasp. So obviously, this is where the increased movement speed comes into play, allowing players to cover more ground, which means less time having to keep the barrier up as your team falls behind you. But barrier stuff aside, let's talk about the massive buff to his passive Steadfast, which has its knockback resistance increased from 30% to 50%. My last video before this shows more fully all the different knockbacks interacting with Reinhardt on the previous patch and this current one, so feel free to check that out. But to talk about the buff briefly, it's honestly quite a strong one against pesky heroes with knockback abilities on a short cooldown, such as Lucio and especially Doomfist, whose Rocket Punch and Rising Uppercut are now way less effective against you. On the flip side, however, the decreased knockback now means it's harder to ride the wave of Roadhog's Whole Hog away from the damage. The initial introduction of Steadfast made sense in terms of being a decent balanced mechanic, plus somewhat made sense lore-wise for Reinhardt. However, I'm not sure if additionally strengthening the ability to let it cut incoming knockback in half was something that was direly needed. We'll just have to see how it turns out in whatever the upcoming meta settles to be. The last tank we're going to go over this patch is Sigma, whose experimental barrier's health has been reduced from 1500 to 900, and its regeneration rate reduced from 150 to 120 health per second. His Kinetic Grasp cooldown has been reduced from 13 seconds to 10 seconds, and its damage to shield gain ratio increased from 40% to 60%. So the changes to his barrier are pretty damn harsh. There's really no denying that. This, coupled with the nerf to Orisa's protective barrier, hopefully all but guarantees the end of the Orisa Sigma meta, which, to be honest, doesn't make me all that sad. As with Reinhardt and Orisa, there's obviously a small upside to make up for the barrier nerf, and Sigma is no different with his Kinetic Grasp. The 20% increased shield gain from damage received is nice, but while the 400 max bonus shield cap exists, I do think that the new 10-second cooldown is the bigger deal in this situation. But of course, they're both buffs to the ability, and it's not like you have to choose between the two, so, you know, whatever. In my opinion, out of the 3 shield tanks affected, I think Sigma comes out of this the worst of all of them, because keep in mind that he does not benefit at all from the armor buff due to not having any armor himself. Additionally, it's quite hard to think of what compositions he will fit into in the future, because while he is used mostly to be a better option than other tanks and off tanks, the choice really isn't as clear anymore. So you have to wonder, right? What does this mean for the 3 tanks? because other than maybe Sigma and depending on your playstyle preference, you might take these changes as perhaps an overall buff or nerf rather than an adjustment. More than anything, I feel like these changes are obviously going to bring about a totally different playstyle for the three heroes, but will also force players to change up their previous mentality on how they approach piloting them. Reinhardt's playstyle will probably be the one that changes the least, though players might find themselves more inclined to be more aggressive. Frankly, it's Orisa and Sigma that are going to be interesting to look at as we venture forward into whatever new meta approaches. I say this because with the severe reduction in potential bears in the game, it opens up so much more possibilities in terms of hero diversity in the other roles, such as maybe even bringing back Zenyatta as a viable support. And in regards to the DPS role, it'll also be nice to have more viable heroes rather than just Doomfist, Reaper, and Mei every game. I'm honestly pretty excited to see where these tank changes bring us, and I optimistically hope it's a nice make of map-dependent metas. Speaking of other roles, let's move on and talk about Genji, whose maximum ammo for his shurikens has been increased from 24 to 30, which is 2 additional primary or secondary fire shots. Yay. Similar to Tracer, Genji really doesn't appear in the patch notes a whole lot, so you would think that when he does, it would be a huge deal, right? Well, as it turns out, not really, to be honest. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is definitely a good buff and a step in the right direction towards helping him out, but I'm not sure if this will help him out all that much. Like a lot of DPS heroes, Genji reacts in quite a volatile way to different metas, and perhaps even more so than the rest. It's been a long time since he had even an infrequent fit in professional play, though he has had mixed success on ladder, which of course depends on the SR level of the match. It wasn't really just the presence of double barriers that kept Genji from being comfortable in the meta, but also the fact that ever since his release, there have been more and more counters to his kit over time. Be it a rocket punch, shield bash, accretion, or the increased usage of Mei, there are now plenty of deterrents out there that make getting value out of playing Genji extremely difficult. Double barrier might be going through its own set of changes, but it remains to be seen how Genji will fare from now on. On a more optimistic note, Torbjorn's overload cooldown has been decreased from 12 to 10 seconds. So, Torbjorn's one of those heroes like Symmetra that are quite reliant on certain map types to pull off a successful win. But more often than not, he is pretty much seen as a troll pick, particularly at higher ranks where dealing with him isn't too much of a problem. The buff to his overload's cooldown, in addition to the added armor buff, injects a nice amount of utility into the ability that can obviously be used in both an offensive and defensive way. Because let's be honest, if a hero is going to remain a niche pick, it only makes sense that they be good at that particular niche. The last DPS hero to receive a change this patch is Widowmaker, who has her grappling hook cooldown increased from 10 to 12 seconds. Honestly, this makes perfect sense to me and even the game developers. With the potential decrease in barriers moving forward, it's likely we will see much more double sniper compositions featuring Widowmaker as well as Hanzo. I really appreciate the proactiveness of this anticipatory nerf because Widowmaker has always been one of those heroes that can utterly abuse the lack of communication on the opposing team, which is something that can often happen on ladder. But honestly, while this nerf to her only means of mobility is nice, I really hope the devs consider keeping a close eye on Hanzo as well, because as I've always said on this channel, he is pretty overpowered as a DPS hero and in the right meta can absolutely shred. Alright, we're almost done. The last hero change this patch is a nerf to Moira, whose Biotic Grasp healing has been reduced from 4 to 3.25, which is about 80 HP per second to 65 HP per second. I mean, it's hard to say I'm surprised by this change. Due to its ability to heal in an AoE, her raw primary fire healing was absolutely nuts, allowing her to immensely sustain her team through brawls and also charge up a coalescence pretty much every fight. And when used in addition to her Biotic Orb, she had even more healing to add to her already metric ton burst. Though I will admit I do think the nerf is a bit much, and perhaps a reduction down to 70 HP per second would have sufficed rather than the harsher 65 HP per second. I only say this because I think that her dominance as a support was mainly due to her sheer survivability in the double barrel meta, and now that it's potentially kind of going away, she won't be as useful as before, and the added nerf won't really help either. And lastly, we have our final event for the year, the annual Overwatch Winter Wonderland. Happy holidays to those celebrating, and a very happy new year to all. Alright, that's it for this patch, so I guess we'll have to see where the meta ends up, because honestly, despite watching a few pro pugs on the PTR and working on this video, I'm honestly still not that sure. Thanks to Patreon supporters Eric Bloom and Reliqual for supporting the channel, I appreciate it so very much. And as always, thanks everyone for watching, and thanks for all the support I've received so far. I'm super happy to say we're almost at 10,000 subscribers, which is honestly pretty cool. I guess I'll see y'all next year. Anyway, take care everyone.